So there's three guys standing around at the bar. There's Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. There's the Pope. And there's Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson says to the two of them, he says to him, well, it's a ghost of Thomas Jefferson, obviously, because he's been gone a few years. I think Sally Heming killed him, didn't she? So the ghost of Thomas Jefferson says to Antonin Scalia and the Pope, you guys are whacked. You think we were Christians back then in the early days of America? We were Unitarians and we were Congregationalists. We were like the most liberal portions of the Christian religion. We were Christians, but we weren't Christians like you nuts were or are.
That's a very good point.
Oh, welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. Tonight I have a return visit from Robert Garavel. Robert had a very intriguing career in the Postal Service. His career spanned 35 years?
37.
But who's counting?
Well, I'm sorry, excuse me. 36 years of active service time.
Yeah.
I had a year of sick leave that was transferred into my retirement and computation. So in actuality, I have 36 years of delivering postcards and 1 year of sick leave that factored into my retirement.
So in other words, you're milking the system for about $100,000 a year of retirement pay, right?
No, that is not, although some people have that image of postal employees making big money. That ain't the case. No, I retired at 70% of my pay.
70%? Okay.
Base pay, and my base pay, it's public information for you folks out there. It's not anything that I'm going to conceal. It was approximately $50,000 a year after 37 years of service time.
Okay, so you have a reasonable salary based on 37 years of service. Okay.
Correct.
And full disclosure, I was also in the post office in Norwalk.
That's right, Dave.
For 7.5 tortuous years inside. And let me tell you something. As many stories as you have to tell about being out on the route with customers and having good conversations, I had exactly the opposite. I was inside with a bunch of supervisors who essentially were promoted to supervisor based on their longevity of service rather than their ability to actually produce or motivate the employees to produce. It was nuts. But let's be positive about it. Tell me about some of your experiences out on the streets.
Well, I've had I often thought that your career is more than just a place where you pick up your paycheck. Mm-hmm. The postal carrier, the person that's in the neighborhood every day, the mail carrier, is probably the most direct link to the government than any other employee. He makes direct contact with people every day. And I thought that was really, in quotes, a cool concept to embellish.
So you were kind of the ambassador from the federal government to a couple hundred people 5 days a week.
I tried to consider myself a representative of the government, tried to project myself in a good image as, would we say, maybe the Norman Rockwell type of employee. I won't use, in my reference, mail carrier, where you might see the mail carrier sitting in the diner talking to a kid like you would see the policeman in one of Norman Rockwell's illustrations. Which brings to the point, I sat the other day with a policeman here in Danbury, and we talked for a few minutes, and I said, you know something? You're not only doing your job, but you're doing your life. You're humanizing your existence.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. That a police officer in the process is not just a guy with a gun or a nightstick or an authoritarian figure. He's kind of like an ambassador of goodwill in a sense, because they're out there doing the mundane kinds of things like having conversations, maybe settling people down if they're in an angry situation. Doing stuff that doesn't get...
Helping the old lady across the street.
Yeah.
Right? Helping somebody get into their car. Calming a person down that's having a crisis in their life. These are all part of community that public service can afford if the employees are cognizant of it. And the important thing is, I would say I work with a great group of employees. The clerks inside, they struggle to get the mail to us every day.
Mm-hmm.
They had their own set of demands.
Yeah.
The carrier, on the other hand, was given the capacity of putting on the uniform and going out and reaching out to the public. Now, you asked me earlier what are some of the things that I remember most. There's many. I probably could have written a book on the little different episodes. I always tried to make something special happen every day. But one of the things that I think about is a little boy that used to live on my mail route. He lived on the dead-end street, and his father worked in another post office. And he would walk to the end of the street with his mother's permission and watch me deliver the mail. And we became friends. Now he's in high school, and he's my pen pal. He writes me letters.
Oh, excellent.
So that's, kind of going beyond just a person that puts the mail in your mailbox. In the process, I was doing my job because we all have to have the mail delivered. I mean, you can't. You do have standards, and you do have your job that has to be done. But getting back to another episode that I like to relate to is there was a young boy. Now, this is in the 1970s when people would get more letters, more recreational mail cards and greetings.
With the first one,
Dave?
With the first one, it almost seems like he came out to observe you because it's kind of cool for little kids. Little kids have an affinity toward people in uniform. You had a uniform on, and he came out to see you because you obviously had to be somebody of importance. We did too when we were kids. I remember the mailman.
Yeah. I remember going on to trains down in New York City. I couldn't wait to sit with the guy with the shiny hat and the coin collector.
Oh, yeah.
And we would sit on the train, and we didn't know what we were talking about, but I wish I had the conversations now. But he took the time to be part of my
part
day.
Of the experience.
And I guess maybe that's where subliminally I got it from, which I think is in a way is a charming life.
Yeah. So the little kid came out and he came out to observe you because you had a uniform on and you had that air about you because you were a man in a uniform. But in the process found out that you were not just a guy in a uniform. You were a person that might take the time to stop and say hello to him and answer a couple of questions about what you were doing and
encourage him with his studies or whatever things were going on in his
education. Help him in his education about life.
And now, as I say, he writes me letters, and I write him letters. He's on his way to college.
Wow.
Another experience I had, which I like to relate, and I don't want to take up your whole show talking about my experience.
That's what you're here for.
In 1970, as I was saying earlier, when people would get more physical mail, we didn't have email then. We had what I call it recreational, non-business mail. Letters from grandma, letters from your boyfriend, cards, greetings. It was all a very big part of personal communications. Mm-hmm. There was a young boy that would stand religiously on his porch every day almost, waiting for a love letter from his girlfriend. Well, I was so inspired by that young man that on my break I took time to fill my 10-minute break by writing a poem about the most important piece of mail in my mailbag. Figuratively speaking or poetically speaking, they're all important, but I pulled out poetry to emphasize my point, and the most important letter was the letter I was delivering to him. I wrote the poem, I kept it, 25 years transpired, and I hadn't seen Lenny in 25 years. Happened to run into him over at Lake Kenosha one afternoon. I said, Lenny, he said, I remember you used to deliver our mail. I said, you remember you used to wait on the porch for those letters from your girlfriend? He said, yeah, I remember that. I said, well, I wrote a poem about you're waiting on the porch almost every day. He said, that lady happens to be my wife now, and we have 3 children.
Oh, that was
a very
cool.
touching. That was a very touching episode in my life that I was part of that romance, so to speak.
Yeah.
It was and you have to, whatever you do in your life. It was great American philosopher, my mentor, Henry David Thoreau, that said, woe to a person who just receives a salary from his or her job because he therein treats himself. Our country, our world today has a tendency to dehumanize workers. This is not good for the health of the employees, their mental health, their physical health, and certainly doesn't bode well for a life well spent.
A lot of us are even encouraged, I think all of us are encouraged, and some of us fall into this trap, encouraged to not like our job. You know, if it's your job, if it's something you have to do, how could you like it? And yet, if you don't have a job that you like, it makes it torture. So if you're doing something that presumably you've chosen to do, why not take some enjoyment out of it? Why not?
Dave, we grew up in the 70s.
Yeah.
And I use this as a metaphor, but there is some application here. In the 70s, you weren't afraid to hitchhike, nor were you that afraid to pick up hitchhikers. Mm-hmm. Today, if you go into 7-Eleven, you want to buy yourself a pack of gum, you lock your car. You know, so there's a difference in the way we think today.
Some of us
as
do.
Opposed,
I don't.
Well, I know you're the exception.
I don't want anybody that might be thinking about scouting out my car when I'm going into a store. But no.
Well, I'm reminded of that trip we took to Woodstock.
Yeah.
And we found flashbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Flashbacks right in front of our eyes of that cordiality and that openness. I'm not talking about promiscuity that existed in that time. The openness, the friendliness. People were talking. People were friendly. It was
talking
really
to strangers.
like,
what a concept! And making new friends.
Right, right. It's something that this day and age has translated onto an electronic screen, and it loses a lot of its authenticity.
Yeah, it's communication is a little bit more two-dimensional than it once was, and that's probably not a good thing.
No, well, it leads itself to all types of manipulations, distortions, and entanglements that are not really there when you meet people in the flesh. There still is the temptation for deception, but now another thing I'd like to talk about, one of our crew here is John Sanzel. His dad used to work on Live on My Mail Route, and I love stopping and saying hello to Andy for a couple minutes. Andy was retired, and the older people on my mail route were always somebody. I don't like to say they were any more special than anybody else. We're all people, but I always realized that they had different needs than the younger people, and one of them was companionship. They'd like to see somebody that they could, hey, how are you today? How you doing? A lot of them were homebound.
And that's one of the, I think, one of the extra special things that letter carriers are involved in.
Right. Let's
just keeping. They keep an eye on the community in a sense. They're not police officers, but they
do have.
If they don't see Mrs. Quigley for 3 days, they might put in a phone call because they're used to seeing her every day, and if she doesn't come to the door to meet the letter carrier for a while, there's something to be considered.
Well, we had a structural program at the post office. It's interesting that you mentioned that, where we would watch for unusual things in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
If we saw people that were going into the house that didn't belong there, and we felt that was somewhat suspicious, then we would bring it to the attention of the police authorities. If one of the things that people did is let mail accumulate in their mailboxes. Now, if we knew that a person was older or an invalid, or even if he was younger, and the mail was accumulating in a mailbox, a lot of young people didn't pick their mail up.
Yeah.
Especially if the people were older, we would bring it to the attention of somebody in the family, or we would call the police and notify them.
Right. That's kind of a red flag when mail accumulates in a mailbox.
Yeah, it is, and it just happened to me on one day while I was visiting, delivering the mail. There was a veteran that lived there, and he was ailing.
Yeah.
And I saw the mail in his mailbox.
Yeah.
So I pushed the door open. I said, "Walt, are you all right?" He said, "Come on in, come on in." He was lying on the kitchen floor. So I automatically called 911, and they came up. But Walt was living by himself, and I realized he picked his mail up every day. And then one night he didn't pick the mail up. For 2 or 3 days it was accumulating.
So there he was on the floor for a couple of days, and might have been there for a lot longer, if not for you.
But Dave, everybody has a capacity. Most people, the key word I like to keep on emphasizing is Don't let any job dehumanize you. And that's a hard thing for people, especially in this tight economy.
Yeah.
We have to realize that we're human beings. We're not machines.
Or maybe the flip side of that is always look for humanizing elements in whatever job you do.
Right, right.
If you find stray moments in your daily tasks, spend those moments reaching out to coworkers. Hey, how you doing? Get to know them a little bit. Maybe listen to their mundane issues and care about, or at least pretend to care a little bit about what they're talking about to make them feel a little bit better as human beings.
Dave, is it fair to say we are all the way we are because of our psychological history?
Yeah.
I was so privileged to have been brought up in a family that fostered these kind of concerns we're talking about right now. My mother was a nurse, and she would go to work when she wasn't feeling well. She'd stay at work later than she should have and wouldn't get paid for it.
Uh-huh.
And she was much in the mode of Florence Nightingale. But, see, this was passed on to me, I believe.
It sounds like the acorn did not fall from the nursing tree very far.
Right, exactly. So, I was very privileged in that respect that I had parents that were concerned about other people. And that's, I'm not trying to sound like I'm a saint, but I think in a way we are all the product of who we are because of things that happen in the past, especially the positive things. The negative things, try and be a duck and let the water run off, right?
Well, people that are overtly religious would say that we're all sinners. But no, maybe we're all not saints, but maybe we're all saints in training. We're all trying to do little things that would make us better human beings. And it sounds like you, and I want to point out, this is very important, that since you retired, you've given a lot back to the community. You do a lot of great things. You're part of our Peace Vigil. Most importantly, perhaps, is that you volunteered to read poetry up at the Brookfield Senior Center. The Brookfield, up at the, what's that called?
The Village of Brookfield
Commons. The Village
Commons,
of Brookfield
right.
Commons, yeah.
It's assisted living up in Brookfield.
Yep.
And you've joined me up there, Dave, which I'd like to thank you in front of the public for that.
So
because
fun.
It's,
maybe I give a little of my time doing that, but when you give your time, often you get a lot more back than what you're actually giving. Because, the times, the Monday afternoon, sometimes when we read in the Alzheimer's ward, and we have folks that are really across the spectrum of cognizance. Some of them are really pretty sharp, but they have some short-term memory issues. And some of them are pretty not really that sharp anymore. But there's always that appreciation of what you do as somebody that's there, not because they're getting paid, but because they take some appreciation in it, and they have this great knowledge of poetry that you have, and a very great volumes of knowledge about different poets. Particularly, you mentioned Henry David Thoreau, and by reading poetry and discussing the poetry with them, you really bring a huge beacon of light to their day.
Well, Dave, it's very easy because selfishly, and this is part of human nature, you look at those old people, and if you have any sense of you being a human being, you would say, what would I want if I was in their shoes?
And I guess it's fairly safe to say that one day we'll probably be in maybe some situation like that. There's a fair chance that you and I will be in their shoes one day. So what was the movie Pay It Forward? Where you do things not on the anticipation of getting immediate compensation in one form or another, but we understand the goodness in people, and understand that if we do something for someone, they'll do something for someone, and eventually it does come full circle, and we get something good back in return.
Well, I'm often inspired by, you said Henry David Thoreau, then I think of Anne Franks and all the torment she went through.
Oh, yes.
And despite
one of my heroes,
all the anguish that her and her family went through in being locked in that attic and being oppressed and finally being sent to a concentration camp and dying. One of her last words she said was, despite everything, I think that people are still good.
Yeah.
Now, having the courage to say that despite everything she went through, was certainly a profound statement, and very inspirational that people can be so tormented and yet still think deep in their hearts that people are not basically bad. I don't think they are. I think our mass culture, our media, can pour toxicity into people's heads.
Mm-hmm. It's just one more hill to climb to get away from that miasma that's sort of thrust upon us, and to rise above it, and to do what we intuitively know is right, and to be the kind of person that we intuitively know will be appreciated. Even if you don't get the words at the moment, the thank you at the moment, you know that we all know, all of us, regardless of where we are in the political spectrum, we understand what separates right from wrong and all the gradients in between. And we're always, hopefully, trying to move ourselves toward what we know to be right.
Well, I have to commend you, Dave, for saying that, number one, but also for approaching the problem in a political sense and reforming a system structurally that can make us, in quotes, to use the words of George Bush, a kinder and gentler America.
Yeah, that was the first George Bush.
That is something that we can do on a volunteer basis. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be really happening as much as we would like. So we approach things in a structural basis, where we can have a system where we do respect workers, where we do provide for their safety, where we do have vanguards for the environment, where we are working to rid the world of war. These are all positive steps. These are all positive steps.
And I guess everything, we can't get bogged down in not ever seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but we know there's a light out there at the end of the tunnel, and we have to keep on plugging away in small incremental steps, heading in that direction. Because things, the old expression, things could always be worse, never were truer words spoken. If we don't do things that make the world a better place, if we stand on the sidelines and observe rather than getting involved, then things will get worse.
Right, right. Well, it's like people have come up to you, I'm sure, as well as myself, and they have said to me, well, you people at the Peace Vigil, you are dreamers. And my answer to that is, I'd rather pursue my active dreams for peace than dismissively accept the nightmare of war and the preparation for war. Because once we do that, then war becomes something that will always be with us because of that negative dismissiveness. It's easier to be, in that regard, part of the problem than it is part of the solution. And it is a big part of the problem.
Yep.
You have to make a stance. And I think by doing that, you're expressing to the community your concern for humanity. And I think that's very important.
And our hard work has not gone unrewarded. I mean, there have been small rewards. We were able to probably end the war in Vietnam earlier than it would have ended. Lord knows it might have still been going on if we hadn't done what we did to try to bring it to people's attention to what was going on. Likewise, in Iraq, I think by standing up and speaking our minds and speaking from our hearts about what's right and what's wrong in the world, wars would be worse.
Well, during the 80s, you remember a president by the name of Ronald Reagan.
Unfortunately.
He was, not to make a political statement here, but supposedly his military budget was going through the roof. We all know that. We were building weapons. We were engaged in we were involved in skirmishes in Nicaragua.
Dirty little wars, I think they were called.
And the military budget was skyrocketing. There was a grave concern in the community for a nuclear war. If you remember that movie, The Morning After?
Yep.
It was sending shockwaves through people. People were having nightmares about nuclear war. There became a national and then an international coalition called the Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign.
You know, I want to interject something. I want to say something really quickly about maybe the intentions are not completely noble, but I'm hearing talk in the Congress in the House and the Senate about Republicans pushing for reducing military spending, because I think they recognize that, pragmatically speaking, you have to cut back military spending, because one of the major reasons for the Soviet Union eventually falling apart was because they spent a full 50% of their gross domestic product, their gross national product, on their military. And the country finally ran out of money and fell apart because they couldn't do anything in terms of social programs.
Well, one of the concepts behind the Strategic Defense Initiative was not
Star
that it
Wars
would work.
Yeah.
It was that it was going to bankrupt Russia.
It would scare them into
spending more money.
Getting into a race, yeah.
To me, that's not what the sense of community is. I love not the people in Russia any less or more than I love people here.
That might be hard. That may be a little hard for some people to wrap their head around, to love people that live in a country whose government is your enemy. And we have the same problem here, where a lot of people in the world love us as human beings, as Americans, but have a big problem with our government.
We should not love ourselves any more or any less than we love the children of Iraq, the children of Afghanistan, the children of Pakistan.
Do you think it's safe to say that we see the phrase often, God bless America? Do you think it might be safe to say that God blesses all nations and all people?
Well, why should we just use America? John Lennon said, imagine no country, a concept that people really automatically refer to as communistic.
Okay.
Communistic.
Yeah, communist, yeah.
Or John Lennon's proposal for a one-world government. What John Lennon's intentions were, in my opinion, was nations... national sovereignty is one of the reasons why we start wars.
Yeah.
When we use the word national security, is it not a cloak for economic and corporate security?
And when people fall into these things, these phrases like "my country right or wrong" and things like that, no, my country love it or leave it. No, my country love it or change it, make it better. We're going to have to wrap it up there.
Dave, thank you so much.
You have a couple of last thoughts to throw my way?
All I can tell you is thank you for your friendship over the years. I've enjoyed that very much. And I tell the people in the audience to become as much a part of the solution as you can and minimize being part of the problem. And enjoy life. Life is beautiful when we can enjoy the simple things. Let's work to make that a fulfillment for more Americans.
And that's all about finding common ground.
Thank you, John, for that.
Thanks, John.